On a cold evening in late January of 1978, when frost had rimmed every windowsill and the lamps in the apartment blocks along Gagarin Street threw pools of yellow light onto the snow, a woman walked across the courtyard, clutching a folded stack of paper against her chest like a talisman. Her name was Irina Pavlovna Volkova. She was 54 years old, a retired literature teacher who had spent 3 decades reading Pushkin and Gorky aloud the classrooms of children and marking little red ticks next to essays that showed promise. She had been a wartime widow since 1944, her husband Viktor having died on the approaches to Kursk. She lived alone in a modest one-room flat on the 5th floor of a Khrushchevka building, her life measured by the rhythm of the city. The morning tram whistle, the lunch queues at the canteen, the weekly meeting at the teachers' club where comrades exchanged lesson plans and cautioned each other about ideological deviations. That night, Irina's breath steamed in the air and her fingers were numb. The paper pressed into her ribs had 20 handwritten pages, neat, teacherly script, and inside them were facts, dates, names, and an accusation. The accused was her only son, Alexei Viktorovich Volkov. Irina had been raised in a household where the party's slogans were as much a part of daily life as bread and tea. Her father had been a factory foreman who came back from the civil hardships of the 1930s convinced that the Soviet project was the only hope for his children. Irina married Viktor at 19. He went to war and never came back. She taught, she volunteered at the neighborhood cultural club, she voted at the local precinct, she pinned ribbons on the school's May Day banner. Loyalty was a moral code as plain to her as the alphabet. To be a good Soviet, in her view, meant putting the collective above oneself. It meant reporting threats, however private, because security was not only a matter of borders and arms, but of minds. When the posters of the 1970s read Vernost Otechestvu, Glavnoye Действо, loyalty to the motherland, the primary duty, Irina took them literally. She had believed them all her life. Her son, Alexei, had not been born into privilege. He had the blunt, practical upbringing that the generation after the war learned. Rationed food, cramped shared apartments, useful skills handed down by practical men. He was bright and exact. He studied engineering at Moscow State University, went on to do his military service, and eventually secured work as a technician at a radio manufacturing plant on the eastern side of the city. He was the kind of man who could solder delicate circuits with the same calm focus that marked his problem sets. He was also, by the mid-1970s, quietly, inexorably changing. At first, the change was nearly imperceptible to a mother who had been raised on a different set of worries. Alexei stayed out later. He stopped attending the local party cell meetings with the enthusiasm he had the previous decade. He laughed off the carefully prepared speeches at the factory's anniversary rally. Where before he had parroted safe lines about the party's benevolence, he now would mutter with an edge that made Irina's stomach constrict that we are always told the same story. He began to borrow books from friends that were not in the sanctioned lists, smuggled translations of Western essays, banned samizdat pamphlets. He listened to foreign radio broadcasts on a small transistor set, hidden in a drawer, its metal face swaddled in an old handkerchief. The radio hissed at first, then a voice would come through from Munich or London or New York, a clear Russian reading news and an alternate world into the cramped Soviet kitchen. "This is Radio Liberty," the announcer would intone, and Alexei would listen. Irina noticed the first time she caught him listening. It was an ordinary evening. He had come home late from the plant, hands still smelling faintly of solder and oil. The kettle was on. The apartment held the quiet, shared contentment of a small domestic routine. When she opened his door, the light in his room was low, and the radio's needle was at a foreign frequency. He looked at her, and in a voice that had the tired calm of someone who had decided things, said, "Mama, you taught me to think. I am listening." She remembered at that moment the old moral certainties fracturing like thin glass. He had always been obedient enough, but obedience had been a practical virtue, not an ideological one. Now he was asking for an intellectual liberty she had never imagined he would want.
For a long time she tried to persuade herself that this was youthful restlessness. He was, after all, only 27. He had friends who smoked foreign cigarettes and told jokes in a tone that made his mother uncomfortable. He had a steady job and never drank too much. But the small acts accumulated. She found photocopied pages of forbidden poetry tucked inside a physics textbook. A coworker's son appeared at their kitchen door one night and lingered too long, talking about dissatisfaction at the factory, about shortages, about how things had been better before. Alexei's voice, when he spoke at the dinner table about technical matters or the latest radio frequencies, took on a hardness, a certain disdain for the ordinary patriotic platitudes Alexei Sima had once recited with pride. He talked about people's freedom to know. He spoke of information as a thing that should belong to those who could make use of it, not be hoarded by the state. To Alexei Sima, raised on sacrifice and collective memory, these were not mere opinions. They were, increasingly, signs of infection. The social fabric of Soviet life made such private differences public sooner or later. Neighbors knew what neighbors did. The building's caretaker kept an account of comings and goings. The local party cell met monthly to ensure that every worker's ideology was on track. In factories, managers reported suspicious absences or deviations. In communities, mistrust was a currency of survival. The KGB ran local offices almost like municipal services, ready to take complaints, document them, and, if necessary, act. The system encouraged suspicion. In the eyes of many, particularly those who had suffered in prior decades and who had witnessed the fragility of the state through the war, the purges, and the rebuilding, vigilance was patriotism. Alexei Sima's internal struggle was not a sudden conversion. It was an accumulation of small betrayals to the certainties that had made up her life. She tried reasoning, bargaining, emotional appeals. She begged Alexei to stop listening to those dangerous voices. She tore books from his shelf and burned them in the stove, the ash forming a gray smudge that she told herself meant purification. She invited his friends to tea and tried, with the tired art of a teacher, to engage them in the canonical classics, to tether their minds to something more established. Once, she reported to a colleague at the Teachers' Club that Alexei had made an offhand, unhelpful comment about a political rally. The colleague, a woman named Vera, smiled sadly and suggested in passing that perhaps she should ask Alexei more probing questions, that perhaps she should keep a gentle watch. It was casual, small talk wrapped in loyalty, the kind of social pressure that breathes its own rituals. The decisive act that turned private worry into public consequence began in the gray days of January 1978. Alexei, ever more restless, had acquired a second, smaller transistor radio, a foreign-made set that could pick up distant short-wave stations in the middle of the night. He would listen in corners of the apartment where the radiator amplified no sound. An old chair near the stove, the small balcony that had been enclosed for winter. The voices that came through spoke of distant elections, of scandals, of avenues for dissent and emigration. They offered a different grammar for the world, not the party's narrative, but an account of people speaking, living, and criticizing without fear. Alexei, who had always been a precise man with tools and circuits, began to treat information the way he treated a circuit diagram: patterns to be traced, connections to be tested. Alexei Sima watched helplessly. Her instinct was not merely to scold, it was to act. For her, in the long arc of a life that had seen communities ripped apart and rebuilt, Ideological deviation was not merely an error. It was a contagion that could threaten the fragile order that preserved her children from hunger and chaos. In her view, telling the authorities about a potential danger was an act of protection, a way to inoculate the community. The internal logic of loyalty to the state had a moral arithmetic. Report one misguided citizen now, and perhaps prevent many suffering later. She thought, in the dim clatter of the kitchen, of the women at the teachers' club whose husbands had been purged decades earlier, and who still carried the memory of what silence could bring. She would not, she told herself, be the one to let a dangerous mind go unchecked.
She began writing. Irina's letter was careful and exact, the hand of someone who had taught pens and punctuation for a living. It was 20 pages long. She began with facts, dates, times, small observable behaviors. She noted when Alexei had returned late from the factory. She recorded the names of 2 men from his plant who visited occasionally and whom neighbors had observed. She specified the radio frequencies he listened to and the times of day when she had detected these transmissions. She recounted fragments of conversations, his assertion that truth should be free, his disdain for official gatherings, the foreign books that had appeared beneath his mattress. She included details that to anyone outside would seem ordinary, to a security officer would read as a pattern. She signed the letter with her full name, her date of birth, and her apartment number. At the end, she wrote, with a rhetoric that was both legalistic and plaintive, "I report this not as a mother, but as a citizen. If my son's mind has been poisoned by the enemies of our people, it is my duty to protect the state he endangers." Handing the pages over to the local KGB office was not, for her, an act of dramatic revelation, but a bureaucratic one. She went during the afternoon, wrapped in her coat, her cheeks raw from the wind. The office was a modest place, a gray building with a narrow waiting room, and the duty officer accepted the letter with a practiced indifference. He asked for clarification on a few names, took down the addresses, and told her she had done the right thing. Irina expected, perhaps secretly, that some official might come and speak with her family, a warning, a quiet intervention, a chance for authorities to counsel her son back to the right path. She wanted, in a private corner of her mind, to be told she had been prudent and that the state would show mercy. That night she went home and tried to sleep, but she could not. The moral calculus that led her to the office now began to rearrange itself into a hard new shape. She had crossed the line. She had made a public act that could not be undone. The KGB moved with the speed of an institution that knows trauma as currency. Within 48 hours, 2 plainclothes officers arrived at the Volkova apartment. They were ordinary-looking men with the clinical politeness of people who perform difficult tasks often. They asked for Alexei, searched his room, and took with them a small black transistor set wrapped in an old sock. They did not arrest him publicly. There was no spectacle. They took him inexorably, with quiet efficiency, like men removing a dangerous article from a house. Irina tried to intervene in the hallway, called for them to explain, to tell her where they would take him for questioning. One of the officers told her flatly to return to her flat and await contact. There was, she later said in small broken sentences to those who would listen, no space in that exchange for a mother to plead or negotiate. What followed was the cold choreography of state procedure. Alexei was brought to a district holding facility where he was interrogated by men trained in the art of extracting statements without resorting to the crude spectacles of earlier decades. The KGB's methods in the 1970s were a study in subtlety, patient pressure, isolation, the slow erosion of certainty rather than immediate physical coercion. Interrogators would lead suspects into contradictions, play off their hopes, offer impossible choices, cooperate and receive leniency versus obstruct and face the full weight of the law. Officers examined Alexei's employment records, his acquaintances, any travel or communication that might tie him to a broader network. They produced in short order enough material to charge him under Article 70 of the RSFSR Criminal Code,
anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. In the Soviet system, the legal category of anti-Soviet agitation was intentionally broad. It encompassed speech, publication, distribution, and sometimes merely possessing certain materials. Possession could imply intent. Intent could warrant severe penalties. The law's elasticity made it an effective tool for social control. A prosecutor could lean on the letter's evidence, a radio tuned to forbidden broadcasts, conversations critical of the party, the distribution of banned texts, and build a case that emphasized a pattern of ideological opposition. The argument the state made in court, and the argument that citizens like Irina now relied upon, was simple and chilling. The individual's thought could become a contagion that threatened not just a family, but the collective safety of the nation.
The trial, when it came weeks later, was a compact administrative affair. In the closed setting of a district tribunal, proceedings not open to the public, charges were read, evidence catalogued, and testimony compressed into a record that favored the state's interpretation. Alexei, who had been hollowed out by hours of interrogation and the weight of an accusation that was as moral as it was legal, made a meager defense that read like the remonstrances of a man who had confused intellectual curiosity with action. He argued that he listened to broadcasts out of curiosity, that he had not distributed materials, and that his comments were private frustrations, not an attempt to undermine the state. The tribunal, following precedent and legal norms that prioritized social stability over individual nuance, found him guilty. Alexei received a sentence of 7 years in a corrective labor colony in Mordovia, a region known in those days for its network of penal settlements and for the harsh conditions that tested minds and bodies alike. Irina received the notification by registered mail, a small official envelope stamped with bureaucratic finality. The notice was curt and clinical: name, charge, article number, sentence. She read it at the kitchen table, her hands trembling, not from cold, but from the sudden exhaustion that seizes those who have exercised moral agency only to confront its consequences. She had thought, in some earnest inner logic, that by turning him in, she was saving a life from the lure of dangerous ideas. Instead, the state's argument had been literal. His ideas were a threat that required neutralization. She folded the note carefully and put it in the drawer with other papers, old school certificates, a photograph of Victor in uniform, and the little official notices that had marked different milestones of her modest life. The years that followed unspooled in a register of small griefs. Irina continued to teach for a few more years, though she no longer attended the teachers' club meetings with the same ease. She received the occasional visitor from the local party committee who wanted to check on her loyalty, perhaps to ensure that the family's sacrifice, her sacrifice, had been appropriate. She would say little, smile thinly, and refer to the state's decision as necessary. Her voice, once firm from years of addressing classrooms, became quieter in private. Neighbors noticed she no longer prepared the same elaborate trays of tea when friends visited. Her brown teapot sat on the stove, used less frequently. On the rare days she did speak of Alexei, and she did, but only in fragments, she told the story in the flat, dispassionate language of someone who described a difficult chapter in a long life. "He was misguided," she said once, "and I could not allow him to endanger others." Meanwhile, behind the barbed fences and under the gray sky of the Mordovian settlements, Alexei lived as many did, in the peculiar liminality of those who had been stripped of the ability to lead normal lives, but were still technically citizens. He was assigned to work details. He learned the rhythms of the penal colony, and he wrote letters that were carefully policed by censors.
In one letter that crossed the bureaucratic filters and was delivered to his mother in the final years of her life, he wrote a sentence that would haunt her. "Mama, I forgive you." The letter was short, economized, almost intentionally restrained in affection. He wrote that he had come to understand, in some painful way, the worldview that had led her to act as she did. He told her to live on, to keep the small comforts she had left. She kept that letter in the same drawer as the notice of his sentence, reading it at moments when sleep would not come, stroking the edges of the thin paper like someone caressing the outline of a painful memory. When the Soviet Union began to tremble under the reforms of the mid-1980s, glasnost and perestroika, many of the old legal strictures loosened. Individuals who had once been sentenced under articles whose language was broad and punitive found themselves the subjects of review, and in some cases, release. Alexei's sentence was truncated in 1985 in the early grace of reformers who reconsidered many of the punitive acts of the previous decades. He was released, but not restored. When someone is released from a corrective colony, the world to which they return is unfamiliar and often hostile in new ways. Alexei did not come back to the apartment on Gagarin Street. The relationship between a man who had been labeled a political offender and his family had been strained beyond repair. Society, for its part, had little patience for those whose sentences marked them as potentially unreliable. He moved to Riga, away from the city and the social memory that had labeled him.
The story of Irina and Alexei is not exceptional in its facts. Rather, it is representative of a tragic logic that threaded through Soviet social life for much of the 20th century. The system encouraged ordinary citizens to see themselves as defenders of a larger political project, to internalize the idea that vigilance was moral. That logic produced acts of courage for some and acts of cruelty for others. It led to denunciations born of fear, vindictiveness, conviction, or a complex amalgam of all three. The state's demand that individuals subordinate affection to ideology produced families torn apart by choices that, at the time they were made, seemed to participants recast as moral duties. There are deeper moral tensions here that are worth pausing on. What does it mean to be loyal? Is loyalty to an idea superior or inferior to loyalty to a human being? Irina had lived through war and scarcity and reconstruction. Her moral imagination had been shaped by a longing for order and security. To her, the party was a guarantor of everything that prevented the chaos of earlier decades. Her letter, precise, literate, rational, was an attempt at civic virtue. Yet what that virtue asked and what she delivered was the sacrifice of the most intimate bond, a mother's trust in her child. There is a particular cruelty in a system that can frame such sacrifices as civic piety. To ask a mother to betray her child's privacy is to reorder the moral hierarchies of human life in a way that prizes abstract social cohesion over flesh and blood relations. The human cost is incalculable. For Alexei, the story is also a study in how dissent becomes pathologized. He was not a villain in the cinematic sense. He was a curious man whose curiosity collided with the machinery of a state accustomed to equating unsanctioned thought with treachery. The law into which he fell did not differentiate well between active conspirators and private skeptics. It punished the symptom as if it were the disease. The penal colony, with its forced routines and enforced silence, aimed less at moral re-education and more at containment. To be marked as an ideological dissident in such a system was to be removed from the life of a community, to suffer in ways that were as much about social death as physical hardship. When the archives of that era were opened and scholars began to sift through the KGB's case files a decade later, patterns emerged that illustrated how widespread such denunciations had been. The files contain letters like Irina's, careful, convincing, mundane, and they show the KGB's procedural response: surveillance, interviews, swift containment. Researchers who read those pages noted how ordinary the reports often are: a neighbor's suspicion, a teacher's concern, a worker's grievance. In aggregate, these small acts of reporting constructed a vast lattice of control. The state's capacity to mobilize loyalty into surveillance meant that the edges of private life were porous. A whisper in a courtyard could become an official record and a closed verdict. Some might want to round out this account with judgments on the individuals involved. Yet the more difficult and revealing question is about the institutions and the conditions that made such acts not merely possible, but expected. Fear is not simply imposed from above. It is cultivated in communities through histories of scarcity, propaganda, and the trauma of past repression. Irina had lived within that matrix for decades. Her moral reflexes were a product of a national narrative that equated dissent with existential threat. Her action was monstrous to those who prize familial loyalty above civic duty, and laudable in the grim calculus of a society that valued order above individuals. Both assessments are morally intelligible, and both capture the tragic multiplicity of human motives. In quieter terms, the story is also about loneliness and the hunger for meaning in a brittle world. Irina's life, punctuated by small rituals, the distribution of school prizes, the watering of a balcony geranium, the careful mending of a winter coat, acquired a dreadful gravity when confronted by a son who sought something beyond that routine. Her choice to write, to deliver the letter, to perform the role of a state informer, can be seen as an attempt to reclaim moral agency in a life otherwise marked by diminishment. A widow who had little control left, and who turned to the apparatus that promised preservation even if preservation demanded sacrifice.
The moral aftermath is not tidy. There is no single satisfying judgment. Alexei's later letter, "I forgive you," is not absolution so much as survival's attempt to map the complexities of human pain. What does forgiveness mean between two people whose choices have been shaped by forces larger than themselves? It is an intimate, private negotiation, a quieter, less official ending than any tribunal could provide. The state's records will note a conviction and a sentence. Family drawers will keep a folded letter and a photograph. The city will go on, with trams and queues and birthdays celebrated in tiny kitchens. The human detritus of these acts is never fully accounted for in official narrative. When we reflect on the history of the Cold War, it is easy to picture diplomatic cables, intelligence briefings, and the glint of missiles. That is the appetizing history of geopolitics. Yet the history of totalitarian tension is also held in these smaller domestic chronicles, the stories of neighbors, teachers, and mothers whose choices converted private anxieties into public consequences. A society that turns fear into civic duty will find that loyalty becomes a brittle instrument. It cuts as much as it protects. Irina's story, then, is a lens. It is a story about a woman's attempt to do what she believed to be right. It is a story about a son who wanted a different language for truth. It is a story about institutions that organize life so thoroughly that personal love can be legislated into betrayal. When the last snow of that winter melted and the city moved into the quieter, less brittle seasons of the 1980s, the Volkova apartment remained. The radiator still hissed, the teapot still sat on the stove, the drawer still contained that folded letter. The events that unfolded there were small in the sweep of history,
but they were searingly consequential for the lives at their center. In the end, the Cold War did not only pit states against states, it created an economy of suspicion in which the most ordinary relationships could be recast as threats. Mothers could become accusers, sons could become defendants, and communities could become places where silence was safety and speech a risk. Irina and Alexei's lives were rearranged by that logic, and when we read these stories now, after the archives have been opened and the ideologies have mostly lost their sway, what remains is the quiet human cost: a mother who thought she was protecting the future, a son who sought sunlight through static, and two people left to navigate the ruins of a moral choice made in the narrow, frost-bitten corridors of a winter night. If there is an image that lingers, it is simple and stubborn. A single piece of paper, folded, kept in a drawer for decades, carrying both the authority of the state and the fragile handwriting of a mother. It is at once evidence and prayer, denunciation and plea. It is a document that tells us how ordinary people, acting in what they feel are the highest of civic duties, can become instruments of a system that asks too much of human hearts. And when history asks us to remember, it asks us to see both the decisions and the people who made them, not as caricatures, but as complicated, fallible beings trying to live under the rules they were taught to believe in.